Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about melting paracord ends. I recently taught a paracord crafting workshop locally, and one of the things that people had the most trouble with as beginners was melting their paracord ends and making it look nice. So I want to give you some tips for that today if you're a beginner to paracord crafting. So this first tip actually has more to do with your prep work before you start melting your ends. And that's just to get your paracord the right length. I found that you need only about 1/8 of an inch. If you leave more than that, then you're going to melt your end and just have like this loose knot at the end. But 1/8 of an inch will give you enough room to melt some of the cord and flatten it against the bracelet. So tip number 2 is finding the sweet spot of how close to hold your lighter to your paracord. A lot of people hold the paracord in the flame, but you end up getting these black melted ends that don't look so great. So we were laughing off camera because we have this image in our head of Goldilocks finding the soup that was not too hot and not too cold. It was just right. So you want to find the Goldilocks zone of having the flame just barely touching your paracord so that you can melt it without turning it black. So tip number 3 is to not be overzealous when flattening your paracord ends. After you melt your paracord ends, you want to flatten them against your bracelet. Otherwise you can have some pointy edges that'll catch on your clothing when you're wearing a paracord bracelet. So what I often use is the edge of the lighter and just kind of push that right up against the melted plastic of the paracord. But you can use some other things too, and I'll cover that in the next tip. But there's 2 different ways you can do this. One is to push down hard on the melted paracord and really just make that flat and flush with the rest of the bracelet. What I like to do instead is just to barely push down on the paracord, just so that you get a wider blob of plastic that isn't going to pull through your knot, but it looks nice and clean and finished, and you avoid some of the sharp edges from pushing too hard or not pushing at all. Tip number 4 is to use the right tool when flattening your paracord edges. I often end up just using the edge of my lighter. That way I don't have to set down my lighter, pick up a different tool, all before the paracord dries. But there are a couple different things you can use, and a lighter isn't necessarily the best tool. You can use a smoothing tool, which is just a flat edge tool that's available in our store, and that works pretty good. But you can also use the edge of a scissors, and that'll do the same thing. If you watch the Weavers of Eternity YouTube channel, you'll notice that he does something a little bit unique. He uses the edge of his knotters tool, kind of has a textured surface, and that hides the end a little bit. It makes it less reflective, so it matches the texture of the paracord. Tip number 5 is to hide your paracord ends entirely. Some paracord weaves will allow you to tuck the paracord ends underneath so that you only see them on the back side of the bracelet. A fishtail weave is an example of this. You can put both ends on the bottom and you really don't have to do anything that pretty. A cobra is a little bit harder because you have one string ending on top and one string ending on bottom, but you can tuck that top end underneath, stick it through the last couple weaves, and melt it that way, and you get a pretty nice finished result. So there is 5 tips on how to finish your paracord ends. If you're a beginner, I know this is a foreign concept to you, so it kind of helps to see this played out in a number of scenarios. Before you click away from this video, I do have 2 bonus tips on melting paracord ends when you're not finishing a bracelet, and I'll show you what I mean by that. When you're threading your paracord onto a fid, for instance, you don't want to flatten the end of your paracord, you want to kind of taper it to a point. Be careful when doing this though, because there's a high probability that you'll burn yourself if you haven't done this before. This last bonus tip is for when you're melting 2 different cords together in a splice. The temptation is there to melt those way too much, and so you have a giant blob of plastic that isn't going to be able to be pulled through knots. Instead, it's better to melt just a little bit, push them together, and then kind of shape it with your fingers so that you end up with a nice narrow splice. And then you just want to make sure that you hide that splice underneath your weave instead of putting it in a high tension area like on top of your buckle in that cow hitch. So whether you're a beginning paracord crafter or you've been doing this for a couple years, I hope these tips helped you out. there's other basic tips that you want us to go over, let us know in the comments. We want to hear from you and put out content that you guys want to see. Thanks for joining us in this video, and we'll see you in the next one.